Hi, I'm Larry Blank, and this is From the Pit, number 9. I've been wanting to do this for a while. I hope you've been enjoying my other podcasts when I've been interviewing some really interesting people and talking a little bit about Broadway and music. I've wanted to do one by myself and talk about mentorship, which is very important to me in terms of receiving it and giving it. I was fortunate to have a really sparkling career, which was motivated by my mentors. My first mentor was a man named Leslie Harnley, who I met when he was the music director for the Equity Library Theater production of The I Sing. And I was hired as one of the rehearsal pianists. I must have been all of 16 years old. And I was very ill equipped to be the rehearsal pianist for a Gershwin musical, but they hired me because I was the right guy for the right price at that time. But I was very interested in learning, and he took me under his wing and ultimately became my piano teacher and was very helpful to me until the day he died. I then I had also met Don Pippin. Don Pippin was a major music director on Broadway, very, very influential in making my career happen. And actually mostly responsible for my getting hired for a lot of jobs. And after a while, I would simply get the jobs that he turned down. He'd recommend me, and I'd get it without even an interview. Pretty impressive. And another important mentor to me was a man named Rudy Bennett, who I had met when I was hired once again as rehearsal pianist that I wasn't totally prepared for a production of Man of La Mancha at Paper Mill Playhouse right after it had closed on Broadway. Rudy had been the conductor of that show, took me under his wing, and between Rudy and Les Harnley, I learned to play the piano pretty proficiently for rehearsals. They were very strong men who influenced me on really practicing and learning how to do things properly as opposed to faking it. And they were very deliberate about music and how they used it, and they knew their stuff. Rudy had done many, many shows in summer stock and on Broadway, usually unheralded because he was just an easygoing guy, and he would take an assistant job, end up taking over a lot of the shows that he was assistant for, including High Spirits and Man of La Mancha for most of the Broadway run, and taught me the show cover to cover. And it was Rudy who introduced me to Rene Wiegert, who was the original conductor of Evita, which caused me to get hired for Evita later on. Paul Gemignani took over as music supervisor for the Prince office, but Rene was the original conductor. And it was simply due to my relationship with Rudy. And of course, my major other mentor was Irwin Kostal, the orchestrator, who I met on another show called Copperfield, and I got the show Copperfield on Don Pippin's recommendation as well. And between Rudy, Don, and Irv, I had 3 surrogate fathers who really made sure that I knew what I was doing, mentored me emotionally, sometimes financially, and definitely professionally. And I was close to all of them until the ends of their lives. They were much older than I was. And I have tried to do the same for others that I meet along the way. Because of the way I was taught, it's impossible to really make a break in the world of show or show business or musical theater without having supporters and people helping you to get these jobs. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that. When I met Rudy, who continued to give me piano lessons and conducting lessons. I never went to university. I'd graduated the High School of Performing Arts. I didn't graduate from the school. I was there for almost 2 years, and I switched to music, and they wouldn't let me finish because I was a drama student. So I finished at Bayside High School, but I realized I had to study to really know what I was doing in the music business, and I didn't have time to go to school because I was already working. I was getting hired as a pianist. I was enthusiastic, and I was pretty familiar with the music, and I had a very strong left hand. So most of the dancers really enjoyed the fact that I could keep a beat. Very useful thing. And I could read almost anything. And I was very familiar with show music. That's all I cared about. So I studied it all the time. So when auditions would come for a new show, I was quite prepared. For instance, in 1964, when I was only 12 years old, Funny Girl was a big hit on Broadway, but people were always singing Don't Rain on My Parade at auditions, and I knew it backwards and forwards. I can play it in any key, and it did me very well at auditions. So somewhere around 1965, my friend Don Oliver and I called up Don Pippin, who was a very major music director, and we just said we'd like to meet him, and he invited us over to his apartment. Remember, we're 13 years old, so we're two stage-struck little kids. He played lots of music for us and talked to us about Broadway, and I guess he was happy to have two young fans talking to him. Told us that he had been offered the show A Time for Singing by his friend John Morris, but he was turning it down because he was going to conduct a new show called Mame by Jerry Herman, who had written, of course, Hello, Dolly and Milk and Honey. So Jerry was a big name already. Hello, Dolly was a giant success at the time. And Don was going to be the music director of Mame. What had happened, Jerry had come in and ghosted some songs on a show called Ben Franklin in Paris. And Don was the conductor. They became friends, and that made Don's career until the end of his life by working all those shows with Jerry Herman and many other composers, of course. Don had a very long and successful career, and the list of shows he did are staggering because they were all giant hits. Shows like Oliver, Applause, Mame, A Chorus Line, La Cage aux Folles. It was just one. There were more, but there was one after another, and they were all big hits, which gave him a great deal of credibility. You can conduct 20 flops and have no credibility at all because they're all flops, even though you've done a lot of shows. So it helps to have a hit. I was fortunate early on because of Don to get there playing our song, which gave me a great deal of credibility because it was a big hit show after Chorus Line for Marvin Hamlish. So no one remembers the flops that I did except for me. So what happened was we met Don in 1965, and shortly thereafter, when he was doing Mame at the Winter Garden Theater, I went backstage to say hello to him. And he was very happy to see me and very nice. And he said, keep in touch and let me know what you're doing. And as time went on, I would go and speak to Don and sometimes play the piano for him. And he would see that I had improved a great deal. And I was getting quite a few credits along the way, doing a lot of shows in summer stock. And ultimately, I did a production of No Nanette that was playing the music fair circuit. I was assistant to Bill Cox. Bill was very kind to me. He was actually another mentor. He gave me a great deal of work doing summer stock and big shows with orchestras, which was a big training ground for me. And he would have me conduct all the matinees. He just, no fuss, conduct the matinee. And he was very gracious about it. So after conducting Promises, and No Nanette at Westbury Music Fair, the contractor on the show was a man named Mel Rodnan, who was working with Don Pippin all the time. And he passed on the good word to Don that I was talented. And Don's assistant, Skip Redwine, came to a performance of No Nanette and told Don the same. And I had a gift for it, and I was very lucky, and I'd really been diligent studying my conducting, but I was mostly enthusiastic, and it's what I love to do. And Bill was very generous. Bill Cox was very generous in letting me conduct quite frequently. So it was a special time, and I had all of these people recommending me back to Don. So Don started throwing me little bits of work. He had written an off-Broadway show called Fashion, and asked me to come in and play some rehearsal piano on that. And that led to other things. He was doing Seesaw at the time on Broadway, and he invited me to sit in the pit a few times, and I get to meet the musicians. At this point, Mel Rodman, who had been playing at Westbury, was in the pit of Seesaw. And I was becoming a familiar face around the Broadway scene, and that was totally due to Don. In the meantime, I was still studying with Rudy Bennett. Well, then, wouldn't you know, I got hired by Paul Gemignani to be the replacement assistant conductor on the tour of A Little Night Music. It was a big deal. It was 1974. Sondheim was a big deal. Al Prince was a big deal. And Little Night Music was a big success. And I was going on the road to replace Danny Trube, who is now a very successful and famous orchestrator, as assistant conductor. Danny was going off to do the dance music for a Broadway show called Good Time Charlie with Joel Grey. Anyway, I went on the road, got a lot of experience, met a lot of interesting people, got to conduct the show a few times. Steve Sondheim and Hal Prince became familiar with my work at age 22, which paid off much later. And I came back to New York after the tour closed, looking for work, and my friend Arthur Rubinstein, not Artur Rubinstein, but Arthur Rubinstein, a Broadway conductor who had done several shows, was conducting Good Time Charlie, and he was leaving the show to do another project, and asked me at age 22 or 23, I hadn't yet turned 23, if I wanted to take over the show, which was shocking to everybody. But indeed I did, and I took over Good Time Charlie, which starred Joel Grey and Anne Ryan-King, and Jonathan Tunick was the orchestrator. Jonathan saw me conduct the show, and everybody liked Good Time Charlie, but it was a flop show. It was opening exactly at the same time as Chorus Line was opening at the Public Theater off-Broadway, Joe Papp's Public Theater, with Don Pippin as music director and a score by Marvin Hamlisch. Anyway, Good Time Charlie was a very successful boon to my career. The composer was Larry Grossman, who took a liking to me, as did the lyricist Hal Hackedy, which caused me to have more work down the road. Anyway, I was seen by all the musicians on Broadway, and it was a big boon to my career. That year, I did a lot of other work, small little shows. I got involved in an off-Broadway show called Christie, which I ended up writing the score for. But I don't like to talk about that. It was also a flop. And I actually got a review by one of the New York papers that said the whole score by Larry Blank is like his name, wholly without distinction, a blank. And that's what I went away with from that score. However, I made a lot of friends on that show, and I moved forward. Sometime later, which about a year later from Good Time Charlie, I got a call from a musician named Felix Giglio, who had been one of the violinists in the pit of Good Time Charlie. He had become David Merrick's contractor, and he was the contractor on a show called Very Good Eddie, which was playing at the Booth Theater in New York with a small band. It had been a show at good speed. Eddie Strauss was the conductor, and Eddie was taking a week off. And because of my stint on Good Time Charlie, where I walked in without a rehearsal and did a good job, Felix recommended me to take over. So I went in and replaced Eddie for a week or two on Good Time Charlie. I now had 2 Broadway credits out of nowhere. And I did well by it. And David Merrick, of course, was a very big producer. He didn't take notice of me because Very Good Eddie was just a show he stuck into the Booth Theater among his many other shows. But I made my points with the musicians and got to be known, and of course became very friendly with Eddie Strauss, who was a very successful keyboard player and then a conductor for a lot of shows on Broadway. Much later, Eddie was the original keyboard player on Merrily We Roll Along and Evita. And later on, and I'm getting to my favorite part of the story, which is Don Pippin was doing a chorus line, which was a giant success on Broadway. It opened in the summer of '75 at the Shubert Theater after moving from Joe Papp's theater. And they were putting out first a national tour, which was the Broadway company going to Los Angeles, and then they were doing the International Company, which was an American cast that opened in Toronto and went to London for a year. They were coming back to the States, and they were going to do a very big tour. And Don Pippin said, I'm going to recommend you to be the music director for Chorus Line, the International Company, when it comes back to the States. Well, this was, a staggering compliment to me and for my career. It was all because of meeting Don Pippin when I was 12, 13 years old. I'd progressed to this point. I was now 25 years old. I had 2 Broadway credits, a national tour credit of A Little Night Music, and a whole bunch of summer stock credits and lots of little shows that I had done. There was a great deal more work in that time period. There was so much summer stock and so much regional theater and local theater. There was always, and off-Broadway was very busy at the time as well. So there were lots of jobs to be gotten, a lot more than there is now. So it was a little bit easier to work steadily and make a living. Well, I met with Michael Bennett, who was a big name at the time because he was so famous from Chorus Line. And actually, they kind of made me wait 2 months before they actually offered me the job. And one day the phone rang, and it was Don Pippin. He said, Michael Bennett says you're hired as the music director for the International Company. I was shocked and really pleased. Interestingly, an hour later, I got a phone call from another great music director and also somewhat of a mentor, Peter Howard, who asked me if I wanted to be his associate on a new musical he was taking from Goodspeed called Annie. Well, I told Peter that I had just been offered the tour of Chorus Line. He said, of course, you must take that, even though there's a Broadway show. To be the music director of Chorus Line, it's a giant feather in your cap, and he was very supportive. I recommended my dear friend Bob Billig to help him out on Annie, and Bob was indeed the original pianist on Annie, and moved on, of course, to many other shows, including Les Mis and Miss Saigon and Best Little Grouse in Texas, among others. So we were all helping each other out, getting work and stuff like that. I went out on the tour of Chorus Line, but first I had to learn the show. So I went in the pit at the Shubert with Don, and I watched the show, and I realized that the way to do this and not make too much fuss was to do exactly what Don was doing. So I learned to conduct the show beat for beat as he did it. And I was going to walk in and do his show. In my mind, there was no way I could fail if I did my homework. Well, the way it worked out, this was a production that was running for a year in London, so all of the actors knew the show backwards and forwards. They were used to their British conductor, and I was this young kid stepping in, and it was going to be a change for them. Well, the first time I met everybody and conducted the show was at the Sitzprobe. The Sitzprobe is when the first time the cast is singing with the orchestra. And of course, they knew the show backwards and forwards. I only knew it from studying it with Don. Everybody was there, and I basically had to conduct a run-through. This was at the Mechanic Theater in Baltimore. There was a very good orchestra there, contracted by trombonist John Mellick. The orchestra was wonderful, and Don was there cheering me on. Michael Bennett was there. I conducted from top to bottom a run-through of the show, and it was Don's show, so everything went perfectly. Michael Bennett came over, put his arm around me and said, "Great job. I'm so happy we hired you." Don Pippen said, "Good boy," took me to dinner and put me on the road with Chorus Line. I did the show for a year, and it was one of the best times in my life because I was conducting this fabulous show with music by Marvin Hamlisch, whom I had never met at this point. However, I did receive a phone call from Marvin when we were in Baltimore. His father had passed, and we put in a new arrangement of What I Did for Love, which is the arrangement that existed for the remainder of the Broadway run. It was put into all the companies, and that was the only time I got to meet Marvin Hamlisch or even talk to him. And we played many, many cities. After about a year, I was getting very bored, although I shouldn't have been getting bored because I was 25 years old and enjoying a very successful run and getting good money to be the music director of a giant musical. But I was getting bored, and I went to Michael Bennett and said, "Michael, I really want to do a Broadway show." And he said, "Stick with me, and I'll give you one." I said, "Great. When?" Being 25 years old and impatient. He said, "Soon." So, not paying any attention, a month later I gave my notice, much to Michael Bennett's displeasure, and went back to New York without a job. And perhaps it was stupid of me, but I was terribly ambitious and had a goal in mind. Well, anyway, I started making the rounds to see what shows were available. I ended up working on a few projects. One of them was a workshop of musical called Saravah by Mitch Lee. It ended up going to Broadway, and fortunately I didn't have to go with it because I went backstage to see Don Pippen at the Shubert doing Chorus Line, and he said, "I've been offered a new show by Marvin Hamlisch called They're Playing Our Song." And he said to me it was too flimsy for him to leave Chorus Line to do another musical because Chorus Line was obviously going to run for years and years and years. And in my presence, he picked up a phone downstairs at the Shubert Theater and said, "Marvin, remember the kid who conducted the tour of Chorus Line? I think he's the perfect conductor for you for They're Playing Our Song." I sat there with my mouth open. He said, "Marvin expects you over his apartment on Park Avenue tomorrow at 3 o'clock. Be there." I knock on Marvin's door. He opens the door. Now remember, Marvin Hamlisch at this point had won 2 Academy Awards for The Way We Were and The Sting, and the Pulitzer Prize for Chorus Line, and was on television endlessly. He was on every interview program, talking to everybody, and became quite a celebrity. He invites me in, and the very first thing he says to me is, "If Don Pippen recommended you, you got the job. Can I offer you a cup of tea?" And all of a sudden, I had been hired at age 26, 27, somewhere around there, for a big new musical with a book by Neil Simon, starring Robert Klein, Lucy Arnaz. It was going to be choreographed by Patricia Birch, and Bob Moore was the director, and I had a Broadway musical. As soon as I heard the 2 songs from the show, I knew it was going to be a success, and it started a big career for me on Broadway out of nowhere. Not exactly out of nowhere. I had these guys pushing me. Well, I'm going to jump ahead a little bit just to talk a little bit more about mentorship. So after playing our song for a year, I once again got terribly bored, and I saw that this was just a never-ending path of showing up every night and conducting several shows a week. The good news is Don was doing a lot of concerts, symphonic concerts with Marvin Hamlisch, and his schedule was getting too busy between all the productions of Chorus Line and other things, so he recommended me to step in for him with Marvin, doing Pops concerts. Well, Marvin was playing piano with every major orchestra in the U.S., and all of a sudden I was his conductor. So I was stepping up in front of the Louisville Symphony, the New York Phil, the Los Angeles Phil, you name it, and I was conducting it without much experience, but I was facile with the baton. Marvin trusted me, and in those days, Marvin didn't conduct much. He only conducted one piece at every concert, and that was the Chorus Line Overture, which had been written especially for his Pops concerts. And all of a sudden, here I was doing all these Pops concerts. I wanted to leave their playing our song. I was a little tired of New York and the repetition. I was offered through Renee Wiegert, who I mentioned earlier, from my other mentor, Rudy Bennett, the LA company of Evita. Hal Prince was the director, Larry Fuller was the choreographer, and I said, wow, this is a great opportunity. Andrew Lloyd Webber, who was not Lord Webber as he is now, he was, Andrew Lloyd Webber, who had written a few successful shows, mostly Jesus Christ Superstar and Evita. So I was a conductor for the LA company of Evita right after playing our song. And of course, it was a big deal in LA, and I got to know a lot of people in LA and was trying to make a transition into doing work in film and TV, which was very active at the time. We're talking 1979, 1980. Well, once again, Larry got bored, and I decided that I wanted to go back to New York, and I picked up a show called Onward Victoria, which ran one performance at the Martin Beck Theater, and that was just like the scene in The Producers when they're looking at the script and said, this is going to close on page 4. Sadly, when I read the script of Onward Victoria, I felt that way. I hate to be negative about it, but I had a very interesting score by Keith Herman, but the book was a little bit off. Anyway, I went to New York, did Onward Victoria. The dance arranger was a wonderful guy named Don Johnston. Don was about to do a show called Copperfield, recommended me to the director, Rob Iskov. Rob Iskov, wonderful director, choreographer. And in the meantime, Don Pippin had also been offered the show, and he told the producers and the authors that I would be the perfect conductor. I was hired for it before Onward Victoria even opened, and I had a month or so off, went into rehearsals for Copperfield. I was thrilled to find out that the orchestrator was Irwin Kostal. Irwin had always been a hero of mine. Number one, he had orchestrated West Side Story with Sid Raymond, but the first Broadway musical I saw was a show called Fiorello, and he was the orchestrator, so I was very familiar with his work, and he had done all of the medleys on the Gary Moore show, and he had done the orchestrations for A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum, many other shows. I was just happy as could be about this project. In the meantime, I was also offered some other projects, which I mentioned in writing and in the book I wrote about my life. But I decided to stay with Copperfield, and it was the greatest thing I ever did because Irv Kostal became a surrogate father to me. And the way that happened was we were doing an orchestra rehearsal, and he put his arm around me and said, I think you're a very good conductor, and why don't you come to Hollywood and I'll teach you to write? And he said, then you'll be able to conduct your shit instead of this shit, which was his sense of humor. But those were his exact words. The other thing that happened in the process of watching me conduct, he said, who'd you study conducting with? And I said, well, I studied with Rudy Bennett, whom he didn't know. And he said, that's interesting. And I said, Rudy taught me the teachings of a Russian conductor named Nikolai Malko. Irv put his hand on my shoulder, and I could actually see a tear in his eye. And he said, I was Nikolai Malko's last student. And at that moment, we bonded. And from that moment on, he was a mentor and a father to me. So between Leslie Harnley, Rudy Bennett, Don Pippin, and Irv Kostal, who could ask for anything more? And I did indeed go out to Hollywood, and Irv continued to teach me how to write. Don was always supportive, and in fact, I went out with the tour of Sugar Babies as well, and ran into Don in Boston when he was doing the tryout of La Cage aux Folles, and he told me and everyone else involved, including Jerry Herman and Arthur Lawrence, the director, that I was going to conduct the LA company of La Cage aux Folles. So my career continued to grow like that, and I knew I was going to be out in LA and I'd be able to study with Irv. So what happened as I learned to write, Don was progressing to doing the Miss America contests. He had been elevated to that job, and he asked me to be the orchestrator. I was really not ready, but he put me on it, and fortunately there were other orchestrators on it, like Harold Wheeler, and I got to learn very quickly. So I always felt, though, that Don was pushing me for orchestration jobs because at this point I had become quite a bit of competition for him in the conducting world. We also did another show together called Teddy and Alice, and lots of other little projects. But then Don started bringing me to London with him, where he was doing many charity galas for a producer named Barry Mission. So all of a sudden, I was becoming known in London as a conductor, all through Don Pippin. And Irv was teaching me to write, and the career was just I was always working. Anyway, the point of all of this is to say that these gentlemen were recommending me for work all the time. Yes, I had the abilities to do it, and I had the ability to come through, but I couldn't have done it without them. And it's been my job to pass this on to some of my friends and younger students who come to me for advice and promoting them along the way. And I try very hard to do that, and I try very hard to teach. And that's why I've been doing many webinars for ASMAC, the American Society of Music Arrangers and Composers. I try to continue what Irv Kostal did for me and what Don Pippin did for me, what Rudy Bennett did for me, and what Leslie Harnley did for me. So this little podcast today was just to thank these gents for what they did for me, tell you a little bit about my career, and how to pursue it is if you're looking for work, you have to contact other people in the business who are successful and ask them for work, and ask them for advice, and ask them for guidance. So I hope you enjoy this, and I hope you'll continue to listen to my other podcasts. Thanks for listening.